Welcome to our Bible study lesson. Today's lesson is called Forever Love. The scripture comes from Hosea chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. And the author's purpose is to experience the unconditional love of God. Now, before I get started with the lesson, I feel I should respond to Pastor Chuck's remark on his last sermon about my accordion. There is a story about this accordion. It was about the early 1980s when the church was still on 146. The sanctuary building needed a new roof. Since we didn't have the money in the budget for it, we did a fundraising effort where people could buy 100-foot squares of roof. To mark the progress, we decided we'd use a song called Dwelling in Beulah Land. The number of notes in Dwelling in Beulah Land equaled the number of squares that we needed to purchase for a new roof. And we thought it would help the campaign along if I played Dwelling in Beulah Land on my accordion. So, we announced the drive for the roof. I played my accordion, Dwelling in Beulah Land, and then announced that for every square that was subscribed, I'd play a note. So if we had 10 squares subscribed, then I would play 10 notes. 20 squares subscribed, 20 notes. Well, you can follow the logic there. Well, after 2 weeks, hardly any squares have been purchased. As a matter of fact, the pastor told me attendance was down for the service. So we decided to change tactics. That Sunday, I got up and said, for every square that was not purchased, I'd play a note. Needless to say, every square was purchased, and that was the end of my accordion career at the church. So much for the accordion. Now let's get with our scripture. Some background, of course, is necessary, or at least I'd like to provide background. And we'll go to the 15th century BC. Moses has successfully led his people out of Egypt, and during his farewell speech, he reminded everybody in Deuteronomy 28 what a wonderful land God was leading them to, the promised land, but that it came with some requirements. And that was that the people really had to behave themselves. They had to worship God. After all, they were his chosen people, and they needed to act like it. So things kind of muddle along till we get to the 11th century, and now the people of Israel are saying, gee, all the other countries around us have kings. Why don't we have a king? We want a king. Well, God didn't think this was such a good idea. He was taking care of everything. What did they need kings for? But the people said they want kings. I like to think that sometimes God displays his sense of humor by giving people exactly what they ask for. It's kind of like how those 3 wishes from the genie always end up blowing up in your face. At any rate, they had kings. They had Saul. They had David. They had Solomon. And then things kind of fell off the rails, and there were some disagreements, and Israel split into 2 kingdoms. This was during the 10th century BC. Now, with 2 kingdoms, you'd think there'd be twice as much chance for someone actually following God. Turned out that the kings in both kingdoms were kind of sorry lots, and they did what the Bible tells us, did evil in the sight of God. Now, 2 weeks ago, we were at 9 BC, and we have Ahab with this showdown with the prophet Elijah, where Elijah challenges the priest of Baal to a sacrifice building contest. Last week, we moved forward into the 7th century BC where King Josiah learned that, well, Judah was in deep guacamole because they hadn't really been following God's law, which they had just discovered had been hidden in the temple for all these years. Today, we're going to go in between those 2 centuries in the 8th century BC. Now, it appears that whenever God was not happy with his chosen people, he would send a prophet that he would speak through to let the people know that, A, they're not really honoring their covenant. In today's lesson, we have the prophet Hosea. So, let's listen to what God has to say to Hosea.
When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him,
Go, marry a promiscuous woman, and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord.
So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea,
Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel.
Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea,
Call her Lo Ruhamah,
which means not love.
for I will no longer show love to Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but I, the Lord their God, will save them.
After she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said,
Call him Lo-ammi,
which means, not my people.
for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel.
So God is telling Hosea that he wants Hosea to marry a woman, depending upon the translation of the Bible you're using, is someone who is unfaithful or someone who is a prostitute, or maybe something in between those two extremes. But at any rate, Gomer is not the kind of girl you would want to take to your parents and say, Hey, I met this girl, and I'm going to marry her. Let's see how the author explains God's purpose for this marriage. I'm going to read a section of the book. People understand Hosea's story in different ways. Some see it as a literal story of God who uses a radical means to get the attention of fallen humanity. Others see it as an allegory pointing ourselves to deeper truth, while others acknowledge that they just simply don't know. These different ways of understanding do not lessen the truths it reveals about God. The Lord made it plain to Hosea that his actions would represent truth, and thus give Israel an up-close and personal look at divine love. Hosea was to marry a prostitute as a picture of how Israel had prostituted herself to false gods and pagan practices. Israel's behavior was like that of a prostitute who deliberately and intentionally chose not to change her way. So, we see that God is intending to use Gomer as an example, or some call a teaching moment, so that hopefully Israel will draw a parallel between Gomer's behavior and theirs. Now, let's not forget there were 3 kids in this marriage, and they were all given strange names that meant God disperses, no compassion, and not my people. What's that all about? Let me read what the author has to say about this. God also commanded Hosea to have children in this marriage. The names of these children would represent and give a deeper explanation of God's wrath and love towards Israel. In other words, their physical presence would serve as a constant reminder of God's forewarned actions towards the nation. The scriptures don't tell us anything about these kids. It's possible they were model children. Small consolation for the names they had. But remember the purpose of today's lesson? To experience the unconditional love of God? Now we've gone through 9 of the 11 verses, and I haven't come across anything that tells me about God's unconditional love. Maybe my virtual co-teacher, Reverend Carol Calvin Dillon, can shed some light on this.
In Hosea chapter 1, verse 10, we come to what might be called the most powerful word in all of Scripture. Yet. Yet. The number of the people of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. And in the place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," it will be said to them, "Children of the living God." Here is God's great nevertheless. Though Israel has been unfaithful, though God's people have wandered from God and chased after other gods, God will not walk away. God will never break God's covenant. God will always be faithful. God is always ready to give God's people a new start. If we can get past our discomfort with the metaphor of the unfaithful wife, we can see into the loving, faithful heart of God, who longs for us to stay faithful to God's covenant.
Each morning, Paul and I begin our day out on the back porch by having a cup of coffee and reading a devotional from the upper room. The other day we came across this devotional called God's Broken Vessels. I think it speaks to today's lesson. And by some marvelous coincidence, I just happen to have it on the screen in front of me so I can read it to you. I have always been fascinated by kintsugi, the traditional Japanese art of mending broken pieces of pottery with liquid gold, silver, or lacquer, thus highlighting and enhancing the breaks and adding value to the broken objects. Kintsugi reminds me of my condition. Many times in my journey of faith, I have found myself defeated, wretched, having given up hope. I was ashamed to face God. I pleaded, "God, I want to give up." My brokenness and my sins mocked me. Then always God's voice would come and reply, "I haven't given up on you, my dear child. Why should you give up on me?" The more broken and shattered I became, the more God's grace seemed to surround me. At times we all feel unloved, dejected, or lonely. But God is greater than our brokenness. Broken lives and broken hopes are precious in the sight of God, who can use even broken vessels to carry out great plans. Our lesson next week is called Promise Restoration. The scripture comes from Jeremiah 23, verses 1 through 8. The purpose is to understand how God restores God's people. Now, I still have a few copies of this book. If you're interested, just leave me an email at bill@seabrookumc.org. Now, instead of closing with a video of a hymn, I've decided I'm going to read the chorus of this poem or song, take your pick. It's called Anthem. It was written by a Canadian artist, Leonard Cohen. I think it provides thoughtful insight to being broken. Ring the bells that can still ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Stay safe and see you next week.